مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. نحن في منتصف فصل الصيف، حين يبدأ الحر الشديد في واشنطن يمثل شبه جزيرة العربية، ويبدأ كثير من الناس في الإيمان بظاهرة الاغترار العالمي. غادر الرئيس والكونغرس ومعظم واشنطن البلد في طريقهم إلى الشاطئ، الجبال أو أي مكان. لم تختف مشكلات دولتنا، وإنما اختفى فقط الأشخاص المنتخبين لحلها. إذن هذه فرصة مثالية لنعود فنلقي نظرة على الضيوف الرائعين الذين شرفنا بصحبتهم في برنامج داخل واشنطن على مدار العام الفائت. دموا جمهوريين وديمقراطيين، صحفيين وسفراء، مسؤولين حاليين وسابقين من مختلف الفروع التنفيذية والتشريعية للحكومة. وفيما يلي بعض من أهم ما جاء على ألسنتي. Juan, when you look at traditional counterterrorism strategies, what will work and what won't work against Daesh?
Well, I think the conventional efforts to constrict their reach and capacity, affecting the external dimensions of their capabilities, can still be applied here. Things like cutting off financing from the outside, slowing the flow of foreign fighters in and out of the territory, disrupting plots that may be coming out of the center of this group. The challenge, though, is this is a group that has a foothold in a broad swath in the heart of the Middle East. And that then resorts to the questions of how do you dislodge a group like this? How do you engage perhaps in counterinsurgency? And importantly, how do you ensure that these ink blots of support that you were just talking to Howard about don't expand? And so that has an ideological dimension to it, where there has to be an undermining of their credibility and legitimacy, but there's a physical dimension, which is they have to be dislodged from the areas that they control, places like Fallujah and ultimately Mosul and Raqqa. And so that really presents some challenges, of course, for any coalition, including the one led by the U.S. from the air, to try to dislodge this group.
Howard, what do you think?
Well, we certainly have a top-down strategy, and it's a similar top-down strategy we've been implementing since 2001. And again, I would say, in my estimation, it has failed. It continues to fail. Every time we conduct a drone strike, every time we conduct a direct strike by U.S. or regional allies in Iraq or in Syria, it plays right into their narrative, and they're able to recruit more and more people. They're able to grow their numbers. In addition, if we accidentally kill a member of a tribe that's not necessarily radicalized and a part of Daesh, then we suddenly find ourselves in more of a counterinsurgency environment, which was one time a focused counterterrorism mission. We've seen this time and again. We certainly saw in Iraq before. We've seen this in Afghanistan. So what we need to do is have a complete change in our mindset. We need to understand the sort of the lay of the land, the human terrain, the same way that Islamic State does, and is that they understand where the real power nodes, where the real immune systems are in western Iraq and eastern Syria, the desert regions, and that's the tribes, that's the clans. These are the same tribes that conducted the Anbar Awakening 2006, 2007.
Howard's absolutely right. I think that the essence in this strategy has to be not just coalescing the international coalition for airstrikes, but has to be the on-the-ground support, the proxy battles, if you will, on the ground that have to take place. You know, in the United States, there's been this grand debate about whether or not there's going to be American combat boots on the ground, and there's been much political fervor around that question. The real question, as Howard has laid it out, is can we support in a targeted way, in an effective way, those that are willing to fight against Daesh on the ground? And that's complicated, but it's critical because it's happening now. And the longer we take, I think, to actually foment that kind of counter movement and support it, the more likely we are to see tribes be unwilling in the future to side with the U.S. or with Iraqi forces or with Kurdish Peshmerga forces. And you're going to see more slaughters and attacks on tribes that haven't cowed to Daesh's wishes.
This brings up a related question, huge efforts in the last decade or so to promote abstinence. Successful or not?
It has had some success, especially amongst teenagers. And I think that's one reason why the teenage pregnancy and birth rate has dropped. But I think that's only one reason. It's also very much the case that teens are using contraception more effectively than they did in the past. But, you know, I don't think very many people, even conservatives, think that someone who's 27 or 28 years old needs to be abstinent just because they're not married. I think that's kind of unrealistic.
And to connect the two parts of our conversation, is there a relationship between unwed mothers and poverty?
There's a very big correlation between being an unwed mother and being poor. Unwed moms are about 4 or 5 times as likely to be poor as two-parent families.
I've had some conversations with Rand Paul. I know Jeb Bush, I've worked with him in the past. Like to get to know a Ted Cruz a little bit better. I know a Dr. Ben Carson. I've worked with him. So I want to vet these folks and hold their feet to the proverbial fire within the party. I don't want to do crazy. I don't want to see crazy. I want to see a cogent, coherent, authentic conversation with the American people that addresses the issues of my community, the black community, that addresses the issues for women, that addresses the issues for a host of constituencies and interests out there that we tend not to engage with. We either ignore or take for granted. So I want to see where they are. And if you come the right way, then, you know, we'll talk. If you don't, yeah, then I may have a few things to say about you.
And does the system that the party has developed, the primary system, the debates, does the entire system, is it set up the way you would want it to be set up to produce the candidate you think best represents the party?
That's a very good question. A lot of people will look at that as a process question, but process matters because it does create the pathway for the end game. And when I was Republican National Committee chairman, we changed and reconfigured the 2012 election. We did this in 2010 by changing the way the process would unfold. And we saw what I thought was very happy to see a very open, sort of almost a wild, wild west kind of primary where you had all these debates, you had everyone jumping in. And for me, it worked because what happened? You saw a candidate like Rick Santorum, former senator of Pennsylvania, with no money, but he had a message. He had an idea or several ideas that he was promoting that resonated with the base of the party. And that allowed him to stay in a race and not get pushed out of it because he didn't have the big cash of the Romney campaign. What they've done for this upcoming presidential cycle, what the current leadership has done, has scaled that back a little bit. So they moved the convention up, they shortened the primary season with the number of debates that they're going to see. And we'll see how that plays out in getting to the question of nominating the right kind of candidate. I always think more is better. I think the more you open up the process, the greater flexibility you have to allow for people to see who you are. I can't stop stupid. So you can say something stupid in the first debate or the 20th debate. So the number of debates doesn't matter. It is the content of those debates, the quality of those candidates that ultimately matters. And the process is only a platform that exposes that.
If ISIS hadn't executed in gruesome fashion 2 American journalists, would America care as much about the situation and the need to combat the Islamic State?
Sure. Yes, I think so. I don't think that it matters that they were American journalists. I think that people's feelings about how ISIS needs to be dealt with, or just that they need to be dealt with, that the group needs to be dealt with, are driven much more by, you know, a widespread appreciation of lots and lots of sort of vicious things that ISIS is doing. And generally, you know, this isn't, you know, the days of you know, the British Empire where you had to send a signal if one, you know, you have a colonial official somewhere in some outpost, and he's the one kind of face of the British Empire. Something happens to him, you have to deal with it to send a message to know that, to let them know that that's not okay. This isn't that era anymore. I don't think that U.S. policy is going to be governed to that extent by the need to respond to specific acts. I think that the need to respond is based much more on the potential threat to the homeland, and at least the perceptions of the threat to the homeland.
Yeah, I guess I have a slightly different take. I think that you know, the policymakers who are, you know, and fundamentally the president who made the decision to essentially go to war against ISIS did it for, I think, a variety of underlying reasons related to broader security concerns. And but if you look at the American people, before the beheadings on videos, they didn't want to go to war against ISIS, and after, they did. You know, just a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, Americans were polling saying that, you know, we're very isolationist, saying that, you know, a majority said that the United States should mind its own business internationally, the highest that this has ever been recorded since the 1960s when they started asking that question. Today, a majority of the people say the United States should bomb ISIS. That is a marked change in public opinion, and I think it's almost exclusively due to the stories that have come out, particularly of what has happened to Americans, but also these broader kind of barbarities that we've seen.
So if we've identified a couple of major threats to the interests that both of you listed, now let's talk about how you form a strategy. Just identifying what the interests are and identifying the threats is half the story at most. How do you come up with a strategy? How does that process work? Whose job is it to come up with a strategy?
Well, I can give you a little insight. I worked on the Middle East on the National Security Council staff at the White House, and one of the jobs there was to come up with strategies for the U.S. government for what we should do. You sort of identify your interests, and then you identify a plan for how you're going to achieve those interests, and then you try to determine what resources it's going to take, diplomatic, military, financial, et cetera, to achieve that. That sounds much more systematic than in fact it actually is, because what it really is a lot of meetings, usually organized by the White House, of people from the State Department, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, the Treasury Department, coming together to try to hash through, given the opportunities you have over the next year or 2 years, what you're going to do. And then once you have that within the U.S. government, and you have everybody has sort of come together and agreed on a plan or a way forward, then you have to begin to sort of talk to your friends and partners internationally about this. So it's a pretty laborious process if you're talking about a big strategy here.
And is there ever a single paper that has on it, "This is our strategy"?
There is, but it doesn't mean anything. I mean, you know, the United States publishes a national security strategy, which has parts on the Middle East, it has parts on all sorts of different things, which is of most interest to people who care neither about national security nor strategy. It is more a post hoc rationalization of a bunch of impulses and independent activities to put in kind of an overall intellectual framework.
In the Middle East, it's not just good old-fashioned cigarettes that are
right.
the transmission of tobacco. What else do people do?
Well, they are the very big users of hookahs or water pipes, which I must say are also becoming more popular among young people in the United States and elsewhere around the world. And some of them do so under the illusion that the hookah is more safe than a cigarette, safer. If you want to use tobacco in some way, it would be better to use a hookah than a cigarette, a traditional cigarette or a cigar. As someone who worked on Cuba policy, I know a little bit about cigars. In fact, the hookah is one of the more dangerous ways to deliver nicotine to your system. For instance, just one puff of a hookah is equivalent to an entire cigarette. And an evening of hookah smoking is the equivalent of 5 packages of cigarettes. Now, I don't know of anyone who smokes 5 packs of cigarettes a day, but the person who goes out and spends an evening with his or her friends is smoking the equivalent of 5 packs of cigarettes. And hookahs are very popular, particularly among women in the Middle East, so that in countries like Morocco and Algeria and Jordan and the United Arab Emirates and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, 50% of the women are smoking hookahs. So if we now have breast cancer as the largest cause of cancer deaths for women in the Middle East, that will soon be overtaken, I predict, by lung cancer as a result of hookah smoking. So it's not cost-free, it's not cost-free to your pocketbook, and it's certainly not cost-free to your health.
I've spent the last 35 years in the Middle East, and I did not know that hookah smoking was 5 packs of cigarettes in a single night. That's remarkable and scary. Here in the United States, the word itself has lost a lot of the taboo that it once had, the word cancer. Scary nonetheless, but it has lost the taboo. People talk about it. How did that change here? And then what is the situation with the word as you travel around the world?
Yes. Well, it's a really excellent question and very spot-on perception about cancer. And I think I like to believe that an organization like the American Cancer Society and others, of course, have demystified cancer and have destigmatized cancer in the United States. I remember when I was a child, and perhaps you do as well, that cancer was also something that was just whispered in the corner. And the lady down the block got cancer. But you never heard about it again, and in a few months she went off and you never saw her again, and she had died. So there was a perception that it was something you didn't want to talk about, that you didn't want to acknowledge. And I think we've done a lot to counter that in the United States. I mean, firstly, because there is now hope. We do have so many drugs. We do have so many treatments available. We do have better early detection for breast cancer, for cervical cancer, for colorectal cancer through colonoscopy. So we're encouraging people to get over that fear and get over that fear of stigma and get themselves either screened or look for warning signs and get themselves to the hands of medical professionals very quickly. In the developing world, of course, that's not happening, so that most people who get diagnosed at all, and sometimes they're not diagnosed because cancer has been relatively unknown. Doctors don't necessarily look for the signs of cancer, and people don't know what signs to look for. So they're in stage 3 or stage 4 cancer, which is something which is metastatic, which is spread already throughout the body. And therefore, their chances of survival really are quite poor. So it's very stigmatized. Some years ago, when I was working actively on HIV and AIDS in Africa, it was very, very stigmatized. No one ever died of AIDS. They died of something else, but they didn't die of AIDS because no one would talk about it. Now the sort of elephant in the room, if you will, is cancer. People in Africa fear a cancer diagnosis more than they fear an AIDS diagnosis because there are drugs for AIDS and there are very few drugs for cancer. Again, in sub-Saharan Africa, only 5% of the people who could benefit from chemotherapy receive it.
Are black people in America on the right track? Things moving in the right direction?
Well, it all depends. First of all, black folks have always had to have massive faith in the future because present day ain't been that great. 2009, President Barack Obama gets inaugurated. A study is done and the question is asked, are you optimistic about the future of America for your children? African Americans, Hispanic, Asians, all say with a majority yes. The only group that was not optimistic about the future of America for their children were whites. And I made it clear to folks then, I said, it's because we're moving towards a more majority-minority country, whites in America are realizing very quickly.
Can you explain what that means for our viewers?
What that means is there will be a majority of people in America who are black, Hispanic, and Asian than white. 30 years ago when we heard that, people said, oh, that's 80 years down the line. Well, because blacks and Hispanics were having kids at a higher rate than whites, that number literally went from 2060 to 2050 to 2047. Now some are projecting 2037. So all of a sudden, whites in America are going, whoa, we're not going to be running this thing any longer.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول الأفكار التي سمعتموها لحل مشكلات واشنطن، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.